Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You won't have to hear from me too long. We can move on to the main attraction in just a moment. My name is Mark Wallace. I'm the Chief Executive of Conservative Home. I just want to say, firstly, thank you to all of you. Yet another packed house here in the Conservative Home marquee. Hello to those of you watching on the party's conference app and on YouTube. You'll all get the opportunity to put forward your questions to this event in a moment. It's a great example, this discussion that we're hosting in partnership with the Coalition for Global Prosperity with David Davis, of exactly what Conservative Home was set up all the way back in 2005 to do, and what we've always tried to do right to this day, which is to ensure that we're bringing the very highest quality of political and policy discussion, every single aspect of the Conservative Party and the movement around it, not just one particular wing, one particular angle, to the members and the voters and the people around the country who make conservatism and the Conservative Party what it really is. So thank you all for coming along to take part in that. Thank you to, I say, the Coalition for working with us on this event. And I'd like you to join me in giving a very warm welcome to Ryan Henson and to David Davis.
Thank you so much, Mark. Can everyone hear me loud and clear? Yeah, great stuff. For those who aren't familiar with our work, the Coalition for Global Prosperity brings together military, business, faith and political leaders who believe that an effective development budget, working alongside an active defence and diplomatic strategy, keeps Britain at the forefront of saving lives, alleviating poverty and bringing freedom, security and prosperity to those who need it most. And it's a real pleasure to be partnering with Conservative Home again. This time last year we partnered with Con Home for an event with Sajid Javid, but I was in my spare bedroom, so this is a vast improvement already.
It's not a bad spare bedroom.
And of course, we're absolutely delighted to be here with David Davis, who's a real legend of the Conservative Party. I will embarrass him by saying I voted for him in 2005 as a raw 18-year-old young Conservative back in that leadership election. So this is surreal.
Where were the other 70,000?
And actually, my first question to David was going to be, how did you enter politics? What went through your mind when you entered politics? And David said to me just before the event began, I don't like talking about backstory, but I've broached the question now, so perhaps we can start there.
Yeah, well, the reason I said that was it's become fashionable to talk about your backstory. Everybody now has a poverty-stricken origin in their backstory. I mean, and of course the press are gullible about it. The press believe that Angela Rayner is a normal working class, a normal member of the working class. Of course, not true. The normal working class are not so rude as to call people scum for a start. Let's get it in context. Backstory, let's deal with that, right? I was born, son of a single mum, back in the late 40s when it was somewhat of a stigma. They kept it from me until I was 12 years old. They had to explain to my school every time I went somewhere, why my name was different from theirs, and I didn't even know it was. Then sort of brought up by my grandparents, unemployed in a prefab, and then had the really good luck to go to grammar school. And that's where it sort of started. But the origin of my interest in politics probably starts very young. My grandfather was a communist, member of the Communist Party, leading member of the Communist Party, had actually been locked up, been in prison 6 months, twice. Once for, what the magistrate said was he had done his best to stop the riot, but he was being locked up as a ringleader of the riot. So, that's British justice for you. And the second time of chaining himself to the railings of number 10, I've sometimes been tempted myself, but he did that at the end of leading a hunger march from the northeast. Anyway, so when I was very young, I was, around me, without even knowing it, was him quoting Marx or some esoteric stuff, like Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. I mean, I can remember clips from that. So I was sort of immersed in it. But I didn't really take a big interest, except like all of us do, following the news and so on, until I got to university. And I was at university in 1968, which for those of you who are old enough was the time of the Sorbonne riots and sort of an insurrection, really, through the universities of Western Europe and America. And up until then, I thought of myself as quite left-wing. But I thought I don't believe in these sit-ins and riots and so on. So I turned out at Warwick University to be the only person arguing against these riots in rooms probably 3 times as big as this one, but with 1,000 people in them. It's quite intimidating when you learn your politics, and that's really where it started. And I then became the Conservative leader at that university. Then I became the national chairman of the Conservative students. This was when Ted Heath was the Prime Minister. I used to see him 4 times a year. And actually, now feels a bit like that, to be frank. We'll perhaps come back to that later. And then after that, the party sort of swept me up, and I continued to have an interest in politics, and eventually just stood for an MP in East Yorkshire, and was very lucky to be returned by a fabulously conservative part of the world, which most people never visit, but it's beautiful. But don't come, because we quite like it as it is.
And the reason I was so interested is because we hear lots from parliamentarians now that they take a particular stance on a particular issue because their background points them in a certain direction. Did your background shape your politics, or was it just your background?
I don't know. How can you know these things about your own psychology? I mean, my normal response to why you take up politics is a long family history of psychiatric instability. So I don't know. But you know, I grew up. I mean, everybody knows I was in the Territorial Reserve at a time when the big threat to Britain was nuclear destruction or being taken over by the Soviet state. You know, those options. Those are the big issues. It wasn't then particularly about low tax, low regulation, civil liberties, justice under law, all that sort of stuff. Until while I was a student chairman of the national chairman of the Federation of Conservative Students, Margaret Thatcher happened to be the education secretary at the time, and so I got to see her about 10 times a year. You know, it took about 3 years to recover, but and as I say, I saw Ted Heath, but the issues then were different. You know, but then Thatcher comes along, and up until then, Britain was sort of on a spiral of decline. It felt like it was inevitable that Britain would decline, that the socialists would win the argument. You know, Heath had famously given in to the left argument and abandoned the Conservative Manifesto. You may sound familiar, and so everybody thought, you know, that their job was managing decline. Then along comes Margaret and said, no. Our job is to reverse the decline. Our job is to make Britain a great country again. And she did. And of course she did so by things which were dramatically controversial. You know, all about the miners' strike, but, you know, the budget of 1981 was incredibly controversial. The Chancellor's PPS resigned over it, you know, that sort of stuff, you know. So she changed it. So in a way, I guess my sort of ideological parent is Margaret Thatcher in that sense. She created the ground on what all the things we're talking about. And, you know, I was quoting her at an earlier meeting. You know, she always used to say the foundation stone of conservatism is freedom under the law. And if you want to write something through my career like writing through a stick of rock, it's freedom under the law. You know, it's allowing people, the maximum, ordinary citizens, the maximum amount of their own money to spend, the maximum amount of freedom, the maximum responsibility for their own lives, for their children's lives. That's what conservatism's about. You know, it's about trusting people. You know, and it's not a soft maxim. You know, that means when people get the power to run their own lives, they either succeed or fail on their own 2 feet. And sometimes that's quite hard. You know, doesn't mean there's no safety net. You know, the old adage in my youth was, you know, it was a Churchill quote: "No limit, a ladder with a no limit to which a man or woman may climb, but a safety net beneath which no man or woman may fall." You know, and that's a pretty good maxim even today. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I've gone on too long.
That's good, and it sets me up for my next question, which is very broad, but I'm sure we'll get a bit more deeper into it. Europe, your career has mirrored the UK's relationship with Europe to some extent. A whip during the passage of the Maastricht Treaty, senior minister in the Foreign Office, And fast forward some years, and the Secretary of State for leaving the EU. What was it like to have, well, not so much a ringside seat, but to be a leading actor in what has been perhaps the biggest debate in modern politics?
Well, it was sort of a debate I didn't want to take part in initially. I mean, and ladies in the audience, I won't actually quote myself directly, but when John Major said he wanted to make me Europe Minister, my answer was, "You must be blanking joking." You know, and he sort of looked shocked. Nobody'd spoken to the Prime Minister like that before. So it wasn't the sort of fight I was willingly involved in. But it was the central fight. You know, had the Maastricht rebels won, and I have to tell you, I had a lot of sympathy with them, but had the Maastricht rebels won, then the government would have fallen, and we would have had membership of the European Union and membership of the Euro and membership of the Social Chapter, because that was Labour Party policy. So the reason I fought to defend that treaty, which was a terrible treaty, was the alternative was Euro membership and Social Chapter membership, which would have destroyed us. We wouldn't be where we are today with that. So you know, it faced me with a lot of sort of no right answer outcomes, you know, which is the least bad answer all the time. So it's not, you know, normally I prefer fights where there's a right and a wrong, and I can be on the side of, well, right, hopefully, but you know, I like black and white fights, and these were always shades of grey. I enjoy being a minister. I mean, contrary to what you might think, given a number of times I walked away from it, but you know, it's fun being a minister. You know, it's exciting. You know, you go and appear in front of the House of Commons and defend yourself, which is quite fun. And you know, and on the Today programme and all that stuff. But and also, of course, it is a power. It's a narrow power. I mean, you've got a lot of broad power on the backbenches, but it's a narrow power. So it's an exercise of power, which is, after all, why we join up in many ways. But really, it's not. You know, if I had back in when I was 38, back at the beginning of my parliamentary career, I'd picked out what I'd like to be, it wouldn't have been that. It would have been maybe health secretary or education secretary, maybe defence secretary, and then on to the more senior jobs if I was good enough. But it was the fight that appeared, and you know, I'm afraid sometimes you just have to fight in the fight that's in front of you, and that's what it was. And it's been important, because if we do this right, and how many of you saw David Frost's speech this morning? There was a part of it at the beginning which I like David Frost. I think he's a rather good negotiator. And the part at the beginning, and because I haven't got it in front of me, I'm probably going to paraphrase it. But he said something like, you know, nations or governments which allow its citizens to keep the maximum amount of their income, which allow the maximum freedom, which allow the maximum personal responsibility, which allow them to do what they want with their life, to control their own lives. Those nations are not just richer and more democratic, but they're also happier and more respected. And I think that's actually a fantastic paragraph. I'd stick it on the wall at home if I had it with me, because that's what I believe. You know, and that's what we're about. That's what we as a party. That's why we've been around for 200 years. You know, great nations are not made by great. And the politicians will tell you great men make great nations. No, they don't. What makes great nations are great traditions, great institutions, great history. And our history is a history of freedom. You know, that's what it is. That's what we are more than any other country in the world. We didn't invent freedom, but my God, we embraced it more than most other countries in the last 200 years. And that's what's made our country great. You know, don't believe anything else. That's what it's been about. It's given our people the right to exercise their talents. And, you know, that's why it's a worthwhile fight. Well, I'm still fighting today, you know. When, you know, if I was sensible, I'd be sitting in a bath chair somewhere with not drinking Coke to keep me going, you know. And I'm not sponsored, don't worry.
I think we'll stick with that. Would you say that this debate around freedom, and the Foreign Secretary has mentioned it a few times in her words to the conference, and she's reiterated that point by Mrs. Thatcher, when people are free to choose, they choose freedom. Would you say that's going to be one of the defining challenges the West faces going forward? And related to that, to what extent did the American and our withdrawal from Afghanistan impact the way in which the West will be perceived by our opponents?
Well, they're actually two very big questions. I'll deal with them separately if you'll forgive me. First thing about freedom. The last 18 months has transformed the landscape on freedom. I mean, this time, here I've got four fringes to do in 2 days. Basically, the government's operation in the last 18 months has made freedom popular. You know, you take something away from people, you make it scarce, they suddenly realise they want it, you know, and that's what's going on now. And so I think in all of the Western democracies, freedom is going to be a big issue. People are going to be fighting to get their rights back after 18 months of losing them. So that's that. And I think it's very important, and it manifests in all sorts of ways, but that's that. Afghanistan's a different issue. I was very, very unhappy about the way we came out of Afghanistan, and the way the Americans came out of Afghanistan. I think the blame is shared equally between Trump and Biden. And I think the impact on the Western world will be, the way it's viewed, will be massive. Way back during David Cameron's time, I organised a rebellion which defeated the attempt to bomb Syria the first time around. And he got very angry with me because he thought it undermined his standing in the world. Didn't do anything of the sort. What undermines our standing in the world is people thinking we're trustworthy allies or not, thinking that we mean what we say, thinking that if we say to Afghanistan, we are going to rebuild your nation, we actually do rebuild your nation. But instead what we did is we propped up a completely corrupt regime for nearly 20 years. That's what we did. And as a result, when we pulled back militarily, the regime collapsed instantly. It collapsed because it was corrupt. From I won't name him for libel reasons, but a previous president, his family all got very, very rich, hundreds of millions of dollars rich in short order. At the same time, right down the lowest level, the ordinary policeman was as likely as not to steal your wood supply, i.e. your central heating for the year, or kidnap your daughter the day before she's married to extract a ransom, or stop you taking your goods to market and charge you a tax. That's how it was working. That's why it fell to pieces. I went there after I stood down in 2008. I wanted to have a look at it, so I went and looked on the ground. We talked to 50 different groups of people, from the Taliban, literally, up to the head of the secret police, as it were, the sort of head of the NDS, as it's called. And and it was obvious that was the case. So we were never going to win because. And I said this on Mar back in 2008. I said, if we carry on like this, we're going to lose. And what's happened is it's all sort of imploded at the same time. So there was no good way to come out. That's the first thing. You've got to learn to. I mean, remember Blair said a few weeks ago that his words, perhaps Western leaders were naive to think they could go in for nation building. Right? I went to see him after that and said, well, yeah, but you just didn't try properly. Is what you didn't do. If we're going to do it again, if we ever get into that again, we may not, but if we ever get into something like that again, then we've got to do it properly. And that means the civil side is at least as important as the military side. And compounding all of this, and I know you're interested in this, compounding all of this attitude of the rest of the world to the West is what we've done on aid as well. Because I'm not a big aid supporter. I think I voted against the 0.7% because in my view it's too big an increase too quickly. But once you got there, you have got hundreds of thousands of people depending on you, and you cut it off. That means hundreds of thousands of deaths, and so that's going to impose as well. So you can't pick it apart. You've got this huge package of things, which is going to alter the way the world views us. And bear in mind, we have the biggest reputation in the world. When I was at Harvard back in, I did a 3-month course, an advanced management course at Harvard, and I went into Boston with some mates on the course, and we went to the Mary Baker Eddy College. It was a Christian Science college. It was what passes for history in Boston, and we went for a walk round, and I walked through a great globe about as big as this room, almost, sort of glass globe, and you walked inside it, right? And it was a globe as the world, but you were looking from the inside out. And as we walked through, there was a bunch of us, and an American at the front whispered. Now, what happens if you whisper inside a globe? It echoes back, doesn't it? So at the front he whispered, he thought to his friend next to him, but to everybody, why is it all pink? And I whispered at the back, because it's all British, designed to annoy an American, But the truth is that although empires, doubtful advantage, but the truth is that the aftermath of our involvement in world affairs as an empire has actually been, to a large extent, has left us with a better reputation than maybe you'd expect. Reputation for standing up for freedom and democracy, reputation for defending the rights of man. So that's a very big reputation to lose, and it is, in my view, at risk at the moment.
You've touched on what I was going to ask, so I'll pivot slightly. We've spoken about defence and diplomacy, and you've touched on the real-world impact of those aid cuts in terms of lives lost. How serious, or rather, how important is development to defence and diplomacy in your view? And related to that, if I may, you mentioned that you opposed when the vote came. Can you talk us through that decision to rebel, which I know is not one that parliamentarians take lightly?
The whips think I take it altogether too lightly. Actually, I've got more pins in my effigy in the whips office than I think anybody else. But you never like rebelling against your government. The simple truth. You just don't like. I'm elected as a Conservative. And so certainly if it's a manifesto commitment, I don't vote against it. But there'll be a lot of non-manifesto commitments going on. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this. I take a much more empirical view of this. There are people around. Some of my good friends are very, very pro-aid. And almost it's the sort of driving light of their lives. I'm pro-aid, but what I think of as the right level of aid, and that's defined by what is the need. How is there a famine in the Sahel? Is there a civil war in Ethiopia? Those sorts of things are what decide it, and that's just what the British people think. If you ask British people, are you in favour of spending more money in Ethiopia or more money on your local school? What do you think they're going to say? They're going to say spend more money on the local school. But if you say people are dying from hunger, thirst, disease, civil war in this part of the world, should we help them? 94% say yes. Yeah. So and I sort of reflect that, right? So that was the thing. But I then sat down and said, okay, what's the effect of this? Am I facing a sort of Cameron moment, complaining about his reputation going down the world? Or am I facing something more than that? And I sort of did the sums, and I can't be sure, but I think at least 100,000 people will die as a result of that decision, and that made the decision easy. One hand you annoy the whips, the other hand 100,000 people die, because I thought we were going to win. I thought we would win. We were quite well organised. Care of Andrew Mitchell was over there, quite well organised as a rebellion, but. Then it's a no-brainer. It's very simple, and I'm not viewed as the kindest, gentlest, prissiest member of Parliament by a long margin. But that's an argument you've got to take seriously.
Great. There's one more question from me, and then I'm going to open it up to our audience. So please have your questions ready. Taking a different tack, thinking ahead to the next general election, which I think we're halfway through the Parliament or approaching that. How does the Conservative Party retain its new heartlands, the Hartlepool, if you like, while keeping hold of its old heartlands, the Chesham and Amershams too? Do you have a take on that?
Well, yes. The take on that. I'm incredibly old-fashioned as a politician. I am not a great believer in focus groups and opinion polls, and partly for moral reasons. I think we're elected to carry out certain principles in government, right? And that's what you should abide by. But also because I think they lead you down false paths. Because an opinion poll or a focus group tells you what people think today. And if you pursue a policy today that is popular today but delivers results in 2 years' time which are going to be disastrous, guess what the outcome's going to be, And Margaret Thatcher, probably our most successful Prime Minister since the war, and I include Churchill in that, so our most successful Prime Minister in three-quarters of a century, she was often unpopular at this stage. She was often 10, 20, 30 points behind. Even with someone like Neil Kinnock on the other side, she'd be behind in the polls. But she never worried about that, because at year 4, the policies she had adopted had delivered their results, right? So the real question is not how popular are we, but what results will we be delivering in 2 years? Now, this is made more complicated by COVID because we've lost a year or two, and we've got to escape from all the consequences, not just of COVID itself, but of what we did, all the sort of anti-liberal consequences. But is what we're doing now going to deliver a good outcome in 2 years' time? And then the question I put to you is the national insurance increase going to deliver more jobs or less? Is it going to make what I always think, one of my tests of policies is, I grew up in a household where money was always, and I'm breaking my own rule about talking backstory now, but money was always a bit tight, We didn't go hungry. Sometimes we didn't have much of a choice of what to eat, but we didn't go hungry, right? So we weren't poor in the context of the day when I was a teenager. But, we always had to count our pennies on Thursday night. Thursday was payday in those days. Now, somebody in Barnsley or Rotherham or Hull or on the Teesside, how will they feel in 2 years' time about that question? Will we have had a cost of living crisis made worse by tax pressures cutting people's incomes, or will we have had an outcome which has delivered a better, a better deal, a more relaxed Thursday night on my measure? That's the test, and that's why I worry about the national insurance increase. That's why I worry about the corporation tax. Not that many of my constituents are paying corporation tax, but the people who decide to invest in the factories which will employ them are, and they may well be building in Ireland rather than in East Yorkshire. That's the question. It's not about opinion polls. It's about outcomes of policies and have you got them right. And I'm afraid that's where I'm at odds with the government. That's why I've voted against the government 27 times. That's why. Because I don't think it's important to follow those Tory policies just because they're in the manifesto. They were in the manifesto because they're good for the country. Yeah. And if they were good for the country 2.5 years ago, they're still good for the country today. We want low taxes, not because it means we're going to have no money for the health service. We want low taxes because the economy will grow faster, generate more tax, and have more money for the health service. So putting taxes up, there's a thing called the Laffer Curve. It's the worst named economic theory in history, but, because it sounds like it's a laugh, and it's not. It's a Laffer Curve says, as you are beyond a certain point, you put taxes up, you get less money. And what we should be doing, what Rishi should be doing, what Rishi should be telling his Treasury officials to do is go find the taxes that when you reduce them will actually lead to more. You may or may not remember Nigel Lawson, the greatest Chancellor since the war, without doubt, the greatest Chancellor since the war. He cut the top rate of tax. He cut the tax on the top 1% and he cut the tax on the top 10%. I thought it's a fantastic idea, not because I'm particularly sympathetic to those two groups, but because the result of it was both the top 1% and the top 10% ended up paying several times more tax as a result, right? Instead, what we're doing is putting at risk investment, putting at risk employment, and also just leading the sort of well-off to employ more tax accountants or move their money abroad, or in some cases move abroad. I'm going to tell you, a guy I know, he paid hundreds of millions, so he's rather well off, but he moved to Paris. Why? Because basically Macron, the French government, thought, well, we're going to try and get as many people from the city here as we can. He pays no tax for the next 6 or 7 years. No tax. And they gave him the phone number of the permanent secretary at the French Treasury, just in case somebody tries to pick on him. So, that's how this competition goes on. So we have to devise a strategy which uses those things that David Frost was talking about, uses that freedom, And now look, we've got the best example ever of we've got two of them, of deregulation working. The vaccines. deregulation didn't make us less safe, it made us safer, you know? And in this haulage crisis, in which we're all arguing about who's to blame, what did it do there? It allowed us to create 30,000 more testing places, HGV, by dropping another regulation, which we couldn't have done if we'd still been in the European Union. So, you know, these things, the things we believe in, work. So why don't we just carry on and do them? And if we do, then we'll win easily next time, because Starmer's not really a problem for us. And if we do a good job, and we don't make people think, oh, we've got to have an alternative, if we do a good job, he won't even touch us.
Thank you very much. Right, questions. Who would like to go first? Yes, Ollie. Just gentleman here in blue shirt.
Hi, my name is Ollie Phelan from the International Rescue Committee. And you talked about the importance of development in a well-rounded strategic foreign policy. So I wondered what your perspective was of Liz Truss coming in as a new Foreign Secretary, and what would be the message that you would give to her as she kind of embarks upon her role?
Well, I sort of don't need to, in a way. I mean, Liz sort of starts from a similar ideological position, if we must use that word, or an idealistic position to me. She believes in freedom. She believes in the rule of law. She believes in democracy, and hopefully that's what she is going to be promoting. She believes in free trade. I mean, remember, the thing to remember is the greatest event in the history of mankind, and I say this without blushing, the greatest event in the history of mankind happened in the mid-1990s. Yeah? It was basically the Uruguay round. It was the opening up of free trade for the world, right? I simplify, but near enough. And as a result, 1.5 billion people were raised out of absolute poverty. That's why I call it the greatest event in history. Well, nobody noticed it. No historian will talk about it, you know, but that's what it was. You know, fantastic change, you know, and she's a believer in that. So that's sort of number one, you know. Number two, she is going to be constrained, as any foreign secretary is. I mean, the government's policy is to restrict aid. Hopefully she'll fight against that and try and get more useful aid, and to redirect the aid we've got away from other international organisations and towards the emergency support, because that saves lives, you know. But I think she's going to be pretty good. Now, I say that, I'll just make one caveat. Any foreign secretary, I was lucky enough to serve under a foreign secretary who had the job down to his fingertips, Douglas Hurd, because he'd been in foreign affairs all his life, and so after 30 years he went there. So when he opened his box, the first half of it he could do almost instinctively, and when he got to difficult bits it would take longer, so he had the time to think about that. New foreign secretaries have a tough job to do. I mean, all the top three jobs, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary and Chancellor, are intellectually challenging, but the Foreign Secretary one, it's very broad and it can be very deep, so you've got real challenges. But I think she'll do a pretty good job, actually. I'm quite a fan, to be honest. So I think she'll do a pretty good job. She won't need many lessons from me.
Gentleman at the back.
Hello, my name's Brian Weller, and I'm just wondering, what do you think about the collapse of the Chinese corrupt economy and the attempt by the other continents to integrate along European lines?
Which continent are you talking about?
They've got the Gulf Cooperation Council, the African Union,
yeah.
the organisation.
I see what you mean. All right, okay. I mean, look, I think it's a very interesting, very deep question. I can only give you a short answer. I mean, they're all going to exacerbate something which is a real problem. I just told you about the beneficial effect of free trade in the last 30 years. We are entering a period of mercantilism, you know, of people trying to protect themselves. So the Europeans are mercantilist already. I mean, the single market is not a free trade exercise; it's a protectionist exercise. That's what it's about. It should be called the single regulatory area, really, because it's designed to keep out competition. The Americans have always been protectionist. They always talk of free trade story, but they actually behave in a protectionist manner. It doesn't matter what president there is, really. And they're doing it now. I mean, 3/4 of Chinese exports to America are under tariffs. course, the Chinese the same. They will be more protectionist than they already are. And bear in mind, they carry mercantilism to a modern art form, because it's a combination of protecting their markets, controlling their own companies, stealing foreign intellectual property, all that's a mercantilist game. And so the real big risk is that it'll make all of that worse. All right, and it gives us a real problem, because naturally you would believe, from me, that I want us to be complete free traders, and I broadly, in a theoretical world, I do. But if you are a complete open free trader in a world where everybody else is basically a pickpocket, you're asking to have things stolen from you. So we've got to do a balancing act between promoting free trade, getting as Liz has been doing, getting as many free trade agreements in place as we possibly can, right? But at the same time, not letting ourselves be taken for a ride and losing our intellectual property or offshoring all our business. One of the big strategies, it's not an answer to your question, but it comes off the back of it. One of the big strategies we're going to have to do in the next few years is onshore some of the business has gone offshore. Now you might think, how the devil are we going to do that? But the truth is that the labour cost advantage that China has will become minimised if we can get high investment labour in this country. So you're going to get one British worker, one British worker doing the work of 10 Chinese workers, in essence. So lots and lots of investment. And in that way, we may well be able to onshore business. I mean, in my constituency, I have a little fireplace manufacturer, right? They make fireplaces. There used to be a memorial stonemason, make tombstones, but they moved on from that. It wasn't a growth business. So they made fireplaces, and they lost half their trade to China. And then they invested in these fantastic CNC marble cutting machines and so on. So they had these terrifically good craftsmen who will make one copy of a beautiful new fireplace. And then the CNC thing will make it 100 times, and that's, we're going to have to do all sorts of things like that in response to all these different pieces of the world trying to play a mercantilist game against us. So complicated, difficult, but I think, we can win this, and being outside Europe allows us the freedom to win it. Obviously, you like the answer.
Lizzie, woman in the purple dress.
Thank you, good afternoon. I'm just wondering, you mentioned you've been in politics for a long time, you've voted against the government numerous times. Looking back in history or over your times in politics, is there one thing that you decided to do that now you look back and go, maybe I was wrong at that time, even though I felt right at the time?
No, I got a fantastic, perfect record. Of course there are. I mean, I can't think of them off the top of my head, but of course we all make mistakes, And I don't blame the government for making mistakes. I mean, one of my criticisms of the government is the coronavirus emergency legislation didn't particularly gave them new powers, but they already had those powers under the other civil contingencies legislation. But what it did give them was the right to do these things without coming to Parliament, And Parliament's actually very good, because you've got 650 people there, all of them trying to trip you up. Now, this may not sound like a good process, but if you're a minister, it really is. Because it means before you come, you try and think out the answer to every question and every weakness in your policy, and more importantly than that, all your clever civil servants who are 10 times as bright as you are do it as well, because they don't want you coming back grumpy because you've fallen over in the house. So to some extent we're protected by the institutions. But my point about, it's not great men, it's great institutions, is in Parliament too. I mean, broadly speaking, when I've been wrong, I've lost. Broadly, but there is. We all make mistakes. That's the point of the quote. Well, it's not a quote. I made it up. But that's the point of the assertion. Great institutions protect you from big mistakes.
Front row, Richard Darlington.
Thanks. As the most successful shadow Home Secretary in modern times, I want to ask you about how the government are planning to change the way they deal with asylum claims from refugees. And I noticed that when the government announced that they would take 5,000 refugees from Afghanistan, your response was to suggest that they should take at least 50,000. Yes. And obviously now that the airport is closed and people are burning their papers so that they might be able to get through Taliban checkpoints, how comfortable are you with the government's proposals about dealing with asylum claims differently, depending on how people arrive and actually make those claims?
Well, I'm not comfortable. Let me differentiate this between Afghanistan and the rest of the world for a second. I'm not comfortable with the idea of doing away with judicial review, for example, because judicial review, the point the gentleman here was making, the person here was making, was about making mistakes. One of the things that stops us from making mistakes is the law courts too. We don't like it when we get corrected, but we have to live with it. So changing judicial review is bad. Offshore asylum centres, we used to call this Fantasy Island when I killed it off last time, and I guess it'll be killed off again at some point because it won't work. But the idea now, to put it in direct context of the Afghans, that we're going to take people who had to flee Afghanistan because they were trying to make a working state, working for us probably, either as a member of their special forces, some of whom have been executed and beheaded already, or working as a government official, trying to make this state work and so on, working for us or acting as our interpreters. Our response to them is, right, you can sit in Nauru or wherever, that's what the Australians do, whilst we think about you, it makes my skin crawl, frankly. And that's an emotional reaction, it's not a rational one, but we're going to have to decide there's a special case for Afghans. And there are, by the way, a lot of Afghans putting themselves at risk crossing the channel at the moment. So I would flee under those circumstances. That's the test. What would you do? I would flee Afghanistan. I would burn my papers. I would try and cross the border at night, and then if that meant I had to go up through Greece and so on and get to Calais, and I'd been working for the Brits, I'd be doing it too. Now, ask yourself what you would do, you see. And that's a very, very good test of whether a policy is moral or not, okay, or ethical or not. And at the moment, I'm not comfortable it is. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm actually rather a fan of Priti Patel, but she got the nightmare of a problem to solve. But I don't think they've quite got it right yet. And watch this space for my next 27 rebellions.
Next questions. Gentleman here, front, middle.
My name's Nathan. I was just so obviously you said Rishi Sunak. He's raised corporation tax. We've raised national insurance. We've locked down the country for 18 months. So I was just asking, do you think there's still a big difference between us and the Labour Party at the moment? And if so, what are the differences?
Well, fortunately, nobody knows, because nobody knows what the Labour Party stands for at the moment, right? That's the sort of first answer. And that's the sort of saving grace for us, frankly. But governments, when they acquire powers, hate to give them up. It's always the case, well, what about if it happens next year, Minister? When I want to sort of take away the right to incarcerate people in their homes, to have a whole nation under house arrest, even I would have argued, was not likely 10 years ago. But that's what we've effectively done. And bear in mind, after the Second World War, we didn't give up rationing and we didn't give up ID cards for 7 years. 1952 is when it happened. So we've got to get out of that. And it's not when we talk about the government, it's not the ministers in government. I suspect a lot of the pressure here comes from Whitehall, because they literally will be saying, but Minister, if you get rid of that power, we might have to use it next year. What do we do if we have another pandemic, and so on? That's the first thing. The second thing is we're going to have a big argument inside the Conservative Party about economic policy. I want a wholly made economic strategy. Now, what do I mean by that? We have got 400 plus billion, probably 500 billion of borrowings as a result of COVID. I mean, I'm not just talking about the things incurred during the period of the crisis, but the recovery of the NHS. What we just raised the NIC for is actually a COVID cost. I would put all of those costs in one big bundle, and I'd say, like 1945, like 1918, we've got to have a war loan. And it's going to take 50 years or even 100 years in the case of 19 to pay back. And once we've sterilised that, if you like, it's taken it off the short-term balance sheet, then we talk about how we balance the current balance sheet, how we balance the current account. And we do that by, ideally, in my view, reducing taxes to get more economic activity, to get more return, and make the most of post-Brexit. That's how I would do it. So, but I want to see, however we do it, I want to see a whole strategy. I don't want the Treasury keep saying, oh, we're in deficit. Of course we're in deficit. Oh, we're in deficit. We need to get more money in. They always do that. That's what. When did you ever hear a Treasury official say we don't want any more money? You know, doesn't happen, does it? So I want to see a whole strategy, and so far I've seen pieces, you know, and it worries me that those pieces are designed by focus group and opinion poll. I mean, take the national insurance increase. The one tax that you can get the public to say they agree with, the one tax, other than ones that don't apply to them at all. I mean, people will, yeah. But the one tax is if you say we want more tax for the health service or social care, right? Or pensions. National insurance, people think, one of the great confidence tricks of the post-war world is that national insurance pays for your health care and your pension. No, it doesn't, you know, at all. It's all gone by the time you get to retire anyway. So it doesn't. But it's popular. So they've got this big increase in taxation. If it had been put on income tax, people would have been very cross about it and we would have gone down in the polls. And it's a very, very good demonstration of what I was saying earlier, that do the policy that works and makes you popular in 2 years' time, not the policy that makes you popular now. And one of my fears about our economic strategy is just about current popularity and current acceptability, not about long-term viability. And that's a really serious distinction, and that's why I want a whole economic strategy. I hope we can get it in the budget, a whole economic strategy to deal with the whole entity and point our way forward and show how we're going to make the most of our Brexit freedoms.
More questions? Yep, gentleman at the back.
Thank you, Tom Guhar from Results UK. I'd just be keen to get your thoughts on why you think the effort to overturn the government's decision to do the aid cuts was unsuccessful. If there was anything you could do differently, what would that be?
Oh, it's a sort of big. Well, look, first off, you've got a government with a majority of over 80, right? And that means you've got to get 40 people to decide to vote against the government and then hold to it while they're being rung up by the whips in the first instance, then the Inquisition, ministers, Prime Minister maybe. It's quite a tough backbencher who gets a call from the Prime Minister and says, no, I'm going to vote against you, Prime Minister. Yeah? So quite hard to do. You probably need... we probably underestimated how many we need. We thought we had 50 and it sort of evaporated. We probably need 70 next time. And so that's quite a big thing. Also, you know, Tories are naturally loyal. They want to support their government. You know, they don't want to vote down it. And they were told that this was an important piece of the economic strategy. No, it wasn't, but that's what they were told. You know, at the same time as we cut the billions from aid, we're spending hundreds of billions on HS2. I mean, they kept asking where you're going to get the money from until I stood up and said cancel HS2. They stopped asking the question after that. You know, that's it's a tactical problem, and you know you just need to have lots and lots of spare resources. I'm afraid. I don't think Andrew Mitchell could have done it better, frankly. He did the best he could, and you know, it was a good fight to have, but we didn't win.
I'd like to go next. Woman at the back.
What do you think is next for the aid campaign, and have you got any advice for civil society on what we can do next?
Well, I think, you know, I mean, often the way to judge the best thing to do is to look at what your opponents hate most, all right? And the only time in history any whip has ever been brave enough to pick an argument with me in public was over aid. And he said, you're calling us child murderers. I said, no, I'm not. I said, I'm pointing out the consequences of what the policy is. And that is that women and children will die from bad water, hunger, or civil wars, you know, disease and civil wars. And they got very cross with it. But the reason they got cross with it is they knew that they had purchase. And what I've said to all the people, and Richard and others, you know, come and tell me the consequences. We must audit the outcome. We must audit, and I'll be honest about it. You know, if I'm wrong and 100,000 people haven't died as a result of it, then tell me. You know, but if I'm right, also tell me and give me the details, because That's the only way you've got to move the public as well as the government. In a way, you've got to come at it through the focus group. You've got to say, you've got to get it to a position where the public are all slightly uncomfortable with the outcome of what we've done. And then they will say to their MPs, and they'll say to the opinion pollsters, yeah, I think we should put a bit more money back in. That's the way. I mean, it's visual. I mean, basically, it's gut-wrenching. You've got to deal with the consequences, and that's not easy, because it's unpleasant. I flinch myself, and I'm not soft, so, but that's the best advice I can give.
We've got about 10 minutes left. Can I just get an indication of who would like to raise a question, ask a question?
Somebody over here?
Yep, sir, yep.
Thank you. Talking about great countries made by great institutions, how much has David Cameron's Greensill Capital lobbying kind of shaken your faith in institutions, or our institutions, particularly in the light of Prime Ministers no longer staying in the Commons so long, with the exception of Theresa May?
Well, yeah, I mean, Theresa's a good example. But traditionally in British history, Prime Minister was the last job you did in life. It wasn't a stepping stone to a bank board or something like that. And I happen to be honest. Maybe I'm prejudiced, but I think that actually older ministers are a good thing. They've got more experience. They know more. They're not susceptible to the temptation, shall I say, that others have found. And of course, these people, when they retire, they get offered millions for things, and it's so it is a temptation. But no, I'm not worried about our institutions. I think people will always be fallible. Character is destiny, as somebody once said, and there's a good demonstration, the one you just gave. And I think that our institutions are strong enough to stand up to it. They caught it, they highlighted it. Nobody will do it again in a hurry. Good institutions do not deliver perfection; they deliver correction. When you get something wrong, they deliver correction. As a country, we made loads and loads and loads of mistakes. Let me. Since we've got a little bit of time, let me pick you an example. And some of the members of the audience won't like this example, but all the better for it. For all of the 1700s, we had a terrible record in slavery, right? And all the sort of Black Lives Matter arguments and so on were true. We were because we were the biggest maritime nation. We were one of the biggest slavers in the world. Right? Then in 1807, our institution, the House of Commons, principally led by Wilberforce, but not just by Wilberforce. There were ex-slaves who were part of the campaign. There was the Methodists who were also part of the campaign and so on. We changed our mind. And we decided we were going to abolish the Atlantic slave trade, a really cruel trade which killed vast numbers of people even before they got to America, North and South America. And for the next 60 years, we committed 1/6 of the entire Royal Navy, the biggest navy in the world, to what was called the West Africa Squadron. And for 60 years, we fought a battle which is like the war on drugs today. Nobody thought we could win, right? And there was a technological arms race, faster and faster ships, the slavers getting fast ships, and a little old British frigates trying to catch up with them and so on. And so then we'd capture one and then we'd keep it and use it to chase the next one. It's a tale of daring do, heroism on a grand scale, Navy captains being sued by slave owners for arresting their ships, Navy captains making up the policy on the fly, because Parliament's a long way away. And all of that, for 60 years. And guess what? We won, right? So there's the institution took British standards of civilization, which we'd sort of blinkered ourselves to in the 1700s, and said, actually, we can't do this anymore. We've got to be proper, upstanding citizens. And I wish we taught this in school, actually, because it's a great demonstration of how our Parliament imposes eventually, not our government, our parliament. Remember, it wasn't the government that drove it. It was Wilberforce, a backbencher, that drove it, right? Our parliament said, these are our standards of civilization, this is what we're going to do, and for 60 years we did it, you know? And we're the only country, it's the greatest foreign policy, greatest moral, ethical foreign policy, and the most expensive in the world ever. And it's successful. And that was our institutions working well. So remember, the institutions don't give you perfection, they give you correction. And that's the important thing to remember.
It's great.
Sudden side of questions.
Just here in the front row.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. As a former Shadow Home Secretary and as a senior figure in the Conservative Party, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your thoughts on the government's approach to supporting women and girls. I think you've said yourself that the impact of aid cuts on women and girls worldwide has been and will be devastating, and our analysis agrees with that. But we're also seeing terrible stories, obviously, of Sarah Everard, of Sabina Nessa, of women around the UK today whose lives are not safe or don't feel safe as a consequence of this, and as a consequence of policies under this government for 11 years. I wonder if you feel, firstly, whether the Conservative Party or the Conservative government has a problem with women and girls, or a woman problem. And then I suppose I'd like to ask whether you think Boris Johnson has a woman problem.
Maybe a different question. That's an example of the same words meaning different things. No, I don't think the Conservative Party has. I mean, I was many moons ago. I mean, before you were born. I mean, I was Cabinet Office Minister, and one of my responsibilities was equality of opportunity, basically, in the service. And it was really difficult, frankly, because you're faced with this enormous mass of mostly men, in middle and senior ranks, right? And you want to elevate the number of women. So you've got to start by getting more women to apply. I mean, it may sound trivial, but it's not. You know, when nobody else has succeeded, you don't try yourself, do you? So you've got to do that. And it takes time. Because, you can't just take a lady working at the bottom of the civil service and make her permanent secretary tomorrow, so that takes time. And everybody's unsatisfied with that, including me, but nevertheless it does take it. And actually, the party's been pretty good, generally. I mean, I hate to make the point, but we are the only ones who've had 2 women prime ministers, Everybody else talks about it, we do it, So there is that. Now, so on the employment side, no, I don't think so. I think actually, the truth is, when a Tory party says it wants to do it, it actually means it and carries it through. But it takes time, and it's not straightforward. And you are, even let's say, employment civil service, you're actually employing an issue that starts even further back from coming to civil service. You're attacking an issue which starts back in education and expectations, that are inculcated in education, with girls and so on. So we're correcting all of that, and it's slow, but it's all generally in the right direction. The issue of women's safety is not new, bluntly. It's long-standing. It's incredibly difficult to know how to get right. Let me give you a sort of counter-example. You may not like it, but I think it's important to understand it. And it addresses the issue of conviction rates in rape. All right, in reported rape offences. Only in reported rape offences, by the way. So the definitions are important in this. One of the problems that was facing the Director of Public Prosecutors, I think at the time Keir Starmer, actually, was what the words said in the guidance to police was something like, you must make a judgment of the credibility of the complainant. That is the credibility of the woman making the complaint. And in many cases, you saw with the Jimmy Savile case how he picked people who were vulnerable, right? Very often, people who do this sort of thing, who go in for sexual criminal activities, pick their targets very carefully. And so the result of that is the complainant may be a drug addict, or maybe has got some other issues about her character. And so the Crown Prosecution Service wrestled with this and changed it to they must make a judgment about the credibility of the complaint. All right? Now, what that did was then encourage the police to say, let's say I have complaint A against Mr. Smith. I wonder if there are any other complainants. So that we then got to the point of putting the name of Mr. Smith in the public domain and seeing how many other complainants came along, which created a whole new injustice of itself, because you've got people like Jim Davidson, Paul Gambaccini, not with women, with boys, and so on, where the accusation got impetus from that in the public domain, and careers and lives were destroyed because of a well-intentioned attempt to get this onto a proper even keel and get proper prosecutions. So it's harder than it looks at detail level, and generalities don't work in this. You've really got to look at the detail. One of the things I'm going to ask one of my ex-DPP friends to do is to recommend to me his best, most experienced prosecutor of sexual crimes, because I want to know from them why they lose in court. Is it because you've got prejudiced juries? Is it because of the tactic? What is it? So maybe we can solve that problem. One of the things I would like to see, and this I know will work, I don't need the research, is I want a lot more women police officers. I mean, the culture of impunity that we have in the police at the moment, which has been highlighted by the Everard case, but it's not the first time. There's been dozens of cases, and particularly the Diplomatic Protection Group, who were involved in all the plebgate stuff, all of that, and other things like it. This culture of impunity is a real problem, and one thing which will help it is having a lot more women, a critical mass of women, police officers. It ought to be automatic that when a woman comes in to make a rape complaint, it's a woman interviewing her, not a man. I'm sorry, it's maybe a sexist thing to say, but I think it's just more likely to work, So it's an issue which if we mean to deal with it, not just to get credit for having tried to deal with it, we've got to do it in detail. So forgive me for giving you a sort of rather pedantic answer, but I think it's the nearest to a honest answer I can give you. All right?
I'm afraid we're just slightly over, so I'm sorry to those who still have your hands raised. Before I
really good questions, by the way.
Absolutely. Before I thank our guests, can I say again a huge thank you to Conservative Home. They're wonderful partners each year at conference, and we're very grateful to them. Thank you all so much for being here and for asking your questions. And finally, David Davis, thank you so much for your candour and for being with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you.